In the very first moments after you wake up, before the noise of the world has a chance to settle into your awareness, something subtle is already taking shape within you. It is a quiet threshold, almost unnoticed, yet it has the power to influence the entire direction of your day. Because long before action begins, thought begins. And long before thought becomes obvious, expectation is already forming the invisible structure of your experience. What you consistently assume, you gradually step into. Not as coincidence, but as a quiet unfolding of perception shaping reality from within. So in this moment of attention, it becomes important to recognize something most people never consciously observe. Expectation is not idle hope drifting in the background. It is an active creative movement. It works silently, shaping the situations you move into, filtering how life responds to you, and organizing experience around your dominant inner state, often without needing your conscious permission. From the perspective reflected in Neville Goddard's insights, consciousness is not merely observing reality, it is participating in its formation. The mind is not a passive receiver of a fixed world. Instead, it is continuously projecting assumptions that color and construct what is later experienced as external life. Each morning, you do not step into a rigid and unchanging environment. You enter a responsive field, one that subtly reflects the beliefs and inner certainties you carry into it. This is why expectation carries more influence than effort alone. Because effort operates in reaction to what already appears to be true, while expectation quietly defines what begins to appear as true in the first place. When emotional certainty is attached to a belief, it begins to set the tone of perception. Before any physical movement is made, the mind has already leaned in a particular direction, selecting what to notice, what to ignore, and how to interpret what unfolds. This is also why two people can exist in the same environment, yet live entirely different experiences of it. One may be anchored in limitation, constantly anticipating resistance and delay, while another moves through the same circumstances with a quiet sense of openness and possibility. The outer conditions are shared, but the inner assumption is not, and it is always the deeper assumption that shapes the lived reality, not the surface-level desire. As you continue to reflect on this, it becomes clearer that expectation is not something to be forced into place. It is something to be cultivated gradually, like preparing soil for a future harvest. Thoughts repeated with attention begin to root themselves beneath awareness, and over time they grow into the natural way you interpret life. In this sense, every morning becomes a kind of planting ground, where the tone of your future experiences is quietly established through what you consistently hold in mind. Attention is the medium through which this planting happens. Wherever attention rests, energy follows, and perception begins to organize itself around that focus. When attention is repeatedly placed on limitation, the mind becomes skilled at finding confirmation of limitation. But when attention is gently redirected toward possibility, openness, and unfolding outcomes, perception itself begins to shift, and new patterns of awareness start to emerge that were previously overlooked. At a deeper level, this shift is not only psychological, but experiential. As expectation changes, the nervous system begins to respond differently. There is often a softening of tension, a reduction in internal resistance, and a greater sense of mental space. What once felt closed or fixed begins to feel less rigid, not because external conditions have instantly changed, but because the lens through which they are interpreted is changing. This is where the real foundation of transformation begins, not in forced action, but in sustained assumption. Assumption is the felt sense that something is already true before any physical evidence confirms it. And when that inner feeling becomes steady enough, it begins to influence perception, so strongly that external reality gradually aligns with it in ways that feel both natural and inevitable. From this understanding, it becomes clear that life is not something you are waiting to respond to you. It is something that is already responding continuously to your inner state. The outer world is not separate from expectation. It is a reflection of it. And once this is genuinely recognized, there is a quiet but profound shift in how you relate to circumstances. Instead of waiting for change to arrive from outside, you begin to inhabit the internal state from which change naturally unfolds. This is not about forcing belief or ignoring reality. It is about deliberate alignment, choosing, again and again, to return to a state of expectation that is not dependent on current evidence. It is a repeated inner decision that says, even if nothing around me suggests it yet, I will hold the awareness that something better is unfolding. In time, the mind will resist this shift. It will attempt to pull attention back toward familiar patterns of doubt and past experiences, because familiarity feels safer to conditioned thinking. But transformation does not arise from repetition of the known. It arises from the willingness to remain present with a new inner state long enough for it to become familiar. This is where discipline takes on a different meaning. It is no longer about forcing outcomes or suppressing thoughts. It becomes the discipline of attention itself, the gentle but consistent return to expectation over memory, to possibility over limitation, to assumption over doubt. Each return strengthens the internal state until it begins to feel stable and self-sustaining. As this stability develops, something subtle begins to change in your perception of time. What once felt distant starts to feel nearer. What once felt uncertain begins to feel more inevitable. Not because external events have sped up, but because your inner alignment no longer conflicts with the direction you are moving in. The resistance between inner assumption and outer experience begins to dissolve. In this way, expectation does not force reality to bend. It brings you into harmony with the version of reality that already corresponds to your inner state. And from that place of harmony, life feels less like constant struggle and more like participation in a process that is already intelligently unfolding. If you observe closely, you can begin to sense how your morning awareness sets a kind of frequency for the entire day. When that frequency is tuned to struggle, the mind naturally finds evidence that confirms it. But when it is tuned to openness and unfolding, life seems to offer different kinds of moments. Small alignments, unexpected clarity, and quiet resolutions that arrive without force. Over time, this creates a different relationship with experience itself. Life no longer feels like something you are constantly trying to push through. It begins to feel more like something you are learning to move with. In the first moments of your morning, before memory fully activates and before yesterday has a chance to press itself onto your awareness, there is a subtle opening within you, a kind of mental threshold where direction is still flexible and nothing has yet been emotionally locked into place. If this moment passes unnoticed, the rest of the day often unfolds on autopilot, shaped by old interpretations and habitual expectations. Because before action ever begins, the mind is already forming the tone of what it believes is coming, and that tone becomes the silent structure behind everything you later experience. What you repeatedly assumed does not stay internal. It gradually becomes the lens through which life is filtered. This is why it is important to pause within awareness and recognize something most people overlook entirely. Expectation is not passive wishing. It is an active inner movement. It organizes perception, influences interpretation, and quietly guides you into experiences that match its direction. From the perspective found in Neville Goddard's insights, consciousness is not separate from creation. It is the starting point of it. You are not stepping into a fixed and completed world each morning. You are entering a responsive field, shaped by the assumptions you already hold as true. The outer world feels solid, but it is constantly being interpreted through an inner framework that is far more influential than most realize. This is why effort alone often feels incomplete. Effort reacts to what appears already established, while expectation quietly shapes what begins to emerge as experience. When expectation carries emotional certainty, it becomes the underlying signal the mind uses to organize attention. It determines what feels important, what is ignored, and how events are emotionally processed before conscious reasoning even steps in. Two people can live through the same situation and yet walk away with entirely different experiences of it. One interprets events through limitation, expecting resistance and delay, while the other interprets the same events through openness, expecting movement and possibility. The external conditions remain the same, but the internal assumption reshapes everything. Over time, expectation settles deeper than surface thought. It becomes a kind of inner environment that grows quietly in the background of awareness. Like soil that determines what can eventually take root, it does not demand attention, yet it defines the outcome. Each morning becomes the point where this inner soil is refreshed, and new mental seeds are either unconsciously repeated or consciously chosen. Attention is the mechanism through which this happens. Wherever attention repeatedly returns, perception strengthens that pathway. If attention is constantly placed on struggle, the mind becomes highly skilled at recognizing struggle. But when attention is gently directed toward possibility, expansion, and unfolding outcomes, perception begins to reorganize itself around those signals instead. This shift is not only psychological, it is experiential. As expectation changes, the nervous system often responds with subtle changes in tension and focus. There is more internal space, less emotional reactivity, and a quieter sense of observation replacing automatic resistance. What once felt fixed begins to feel more open simply because it is being interpreted differently. At the center of this process is assumption, the felt sense that something is true before it is physically confirmed. When that inner feeling becomes consistent, perception begins to align with it. External reality is not instantly rewritten, but your experience of it begins to reorganize in a way that gradually matches the dominant inner state. From here, a deeper understanding emerges. Life is not something happening independently of you, but something continuously responding to your state of consciousness. This does not mean forcing positivity or denying circumstances. It means recognizing that your inner condition is always active in shaping how those circumstances are experienced and unfolded. When this becomes clear, mornings are no longer just routine beginnings. They become intentional entry points where you step into a chosen direction of mind before external influence takes over. Instead of reacting to the day, you begin the day by establishing the inner state from which reactions will arise. This creates a shift in position, from effect to cause. No longer waiting for conditions to define your mood or expectation, you begin from within, and outer experience becomes secondary to that internal placement. Even when external reality has not changed, your interpretation of it begins to shift first, which gradually influences what you notice and how you respond. As this continues, the mind will naturally attempt to return to familiar patterns. Old expectations feel comfortable because they are reinforced by repetition. Doubt often appears as realism simply because it is familiar. But transformation requires a willingness to remain with a new inner assumption, long enough for it to become natural. This is where discipline takes a quieter form. Not force, but redirection. A repeated return to expectation instead of memory. To possibility instead of limitation. Each return strengthens a different internal identity, one that no longer automatically collapses under old patterns of thinking. Over time, something stabilizes. Expectation becomes less emotional effort and more settled awareness. The sense of waiting or urgency begins to dissolve, replaced by a quieter confidence that does not depend on visible proof. What once felt distant begins to feel like it is already in motion, even if unseen. This is because expectation does not push outcomes forward. It aligns perception with a version of reality that already corresponds to your inner state. When alignment becomes consistent, experience feels less like struggle and more like unfolding. Morning awareness, in this sense, becomes the foundation of interpretation. It sets a kind of frequency for perception. When that frequency is shaped by limitation, evidence of limitation appears everywhere. When it is shaped by openness, life begins to reveal different patterns, subtle opportunities, unexpected clarity, and moments that feel unusually well-timed. As this understanding deepens, expectation stops feeling like a practice and starts becoming a background state. It influences not just what you think, but how you interpret everything without effort. Even silence begins to feel meaningful. Even delay feels structured rather than empty. And in those moments where doubt briefly returns, there is a quiet turning point. Not dramatic, not forced, but subtle. Either the mind returns to old interpretation, or it recenters into the chosen assumption. Each return reinforces a new pathway of awareness, gradually making it more dominant than the old one. Eventually, life begins to feel less like something happening to you and more like something responding through you. Imagination and interpretation are no longer occasional tools, but ongoing processes shaping expectation beneath awareness. What you assume becomes not just a thought pattern, but a lived identity expressed continuously through perception. And in that realization, something fundamental shifts. Reality feels less fixed than before, more responsive, and more closely connected to the inner state you carry into each moment. Expectation is no longer something you use, it becomes the atmosphere you live in, quietly shaping what unfolds next without needing force, urgency, or struggle. This is not wishful thinking, it is a reordering of inner authority. When expectation becomes steady, doubt loses its role as the final interpreter of your experience. External circumstances may remain unchanged, yet the way you experience them shifts completely. And that shift is where transformation truly begins, not as something pursued, but as something you gradually embody. In this understanding, every moment is neutral, until it is given meaning through assumption. Assumption is the emotional meaning you consistently attach to what is happening. If delay is assumed to mean rejection, frustration naturally follows. But if delay is interpreted as part of alignment unfolding, patience arises instead, even though nothing in the external situation has changed. This reveals something subtle but powerful. Experience is shaped less by events themselves, and more by the meaning you assign to them through expectation. As this becomes clearer, you start to recognize that even memory is not fixed in the way it once seemed. It is not a rigid archive, but a living interpretation that shifts depending on your present emotional state. This means the past only holds influence if you continue to give it the same emotional meaning. In the present, without that reinforcement, its authority over your future begins to weaken. From here, the teachings associated with Neville Goddard become less like abstract philosophy and more like a description of how consciousness actually operates. Imagination is not separate from reality. It is the originating movement through which reality is continuously formed. Expectation is simply imagination sustained over time with emotional conviction. And when that conviction becomes consistent, experience begins to reorganize itself around it. This is why repetition of assumption is more important than intensity of effort. Effort comes and goes, but repetition builds structure. What you repeatedly assume becomes the framework your awareness naturally operates within. That framework determines what you notice, what you overlook, and what you consider possible in the first place. As this understanding deepens, resistance often appears. A quiet internal voice may try to pull you back toward what is familiar, toward conclusions, based only on visible evidence. But this resistance is not a failure in the process, it is part of the transition. It is the old pattern attempting to maintain control while a new pattern is forming. If you do not engage with it and instead return to expectation, something subtle begins to happen. Its influence weakens, not through force, but through lack of reinforcement. Attention is what sustains inner identity. What you repeatedly attend to strengthens, and what you stop feeding gradually dissolves. In this way, each morning becomes more than preparation, it becomes selection. You are choosing which internal state will define your perception of the day. Over time, this selection becomes less conscious effort and more automatic orientation, and life begins to feel less like reactive uncertainty and more like continuous unfolding. Yet there is a deeper layer to this process. Expectation does not only shape external outcomes, it also shapes the emotional tone through which those outcomes are experienced. The same event can feel entirely different depending on the state of mind receiving it. This is where real mastery begins to form, because instead of attempting to control circumstances, attention shifts towards stabilizing inner states. States are more fundamental than circumstances because states determine interpretation. Interpretation determines emotional reality, and emotional reality influences decisions before conscious reasoning even fully activates. When expectation for good is consistently maintained, it does not mean denying reality. It means choosing the lens through which reality is interpreted in real time. As this becomes a way of being, Patterns in experience begin to shift. What once appeared as coincidence starts to feel meaningfully timed. Situations begin to align in ways that feel unusually coherent. Opportunities seem less random and more responsive, not because external forces changed, but because perception has been reorganized around a different expectation. Nothing in this process requires force. Force implies internal resistance. But in this state, there is less resistance and more allowance. A quieter confidence that what is unfolding does not need to be pushed, only recognized. From here, a different kind of certainty begins to develop. Not certainty about how things will unfold, but certainty that they are unfolding. This shift alone changes how you move through each moment, replacing urgency with steadiness and reaction with observation. As you go deeper into this awareness, something more intimate begins to emerge. You begin to see that what you are truly expecting is not only external change, but a different version of yourself experiencing that change. This is the hidden core of transformation. Every sustained expectation is also a gradual identity shift. When you hold a new expectation consistently, you are not just waiting for life to adjust. You are already stepping into the identity that corresponds to it. This is why patience begins to feel different. It is no longer passive waiting. It becomes trust in an unfolding process that is already in motion beneath visible evidence. At this point, there is no sense of separation between inner assumption and outer expression. Life feels less like something happening to you and more like something responding through you. Expectation is no longer a technique. It becomes a background state of being, a quiet agreement with the unfolding nature of experience itself. And even now, there is a sense that this understanding is still deepening beyond language. Because the full implication of living from expectation is not fully contained in thought. It continues to unfold in experience itself, revealing, moment by moment, that what you internally is continuously shaping what becomes visible externally, in ways that are still only beginning to be fully recognized.